Remains is about the impact of war on an individual. In this case, Armitage centres his poem on the real experiences of a British soldier who served in Iraq, exploring the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that he suffered from since his return. Context-wise, it's worth mentioning that a high percentage of soldiers returning from Iraq experience PTSD and still do. I don't have the UK figures, but in the US, the Department of Veterans Affairs says that 20% of soldiers suffered from PTSD on their return. The war is over. It should be the end of the story, as Armitage puts it in line 17, but it's only the beginning. The psychological consequences in terms of him reliving the moment and being wrenched inside by the idea that the looter was possibly armed could live with him forever. The conflict and the power it has over his life continue. The poem is about what remains. The imprint of the traumatic memory is actually what becomes the enemy. Look at what he says in lines 25 and 26. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines. A bit like in Exposure, where it's not just the Germans who are Wilfred Owen's enemies, but the weather, the wind, and the monotony of life in the trenches. Here, in Remains, the enemy is the guilt and doubt and shock of seeing someone else's guts tossed back into their body. This is the enemy he struggles to get to. The dug in behind enemy lines, to me, suggests that no matter how much counselling he receives, and the tone of the monologue itself could suggest that he is recounting his experiences to a counsellor or a friend. No matter how much he tries drugs or drink to flush out the trauma, it's inaccessible, an ever-present danger, raising his stress levels and making him live in a heightened state of arousal or tension, constantly fearing that his victim will appear to him when he blinks or sleeps or dreams. Look at how the syntactic repetition of blink and he, sleep and he, dream and he, highlights the repetitive and unpredictable recurrence of his nightmare. The tone at this point is quite elliptical, which means it's quite blunt and clipped, kind of suggesting that the memory could resurface without warning at any moment. Overwhelmingly, his experience is one of guilt. You could make a good structural point if you look at how Armitage chooses to end his poem with the image of his bloody life in my bloody hands. Possibly an allusion to Macbeth, a play by Shakespeare where Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have blood on their hands following the murder of Duncan. As Macbeth is attempting to wash the blood off his hands, he says, "Will all great Neptunes wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." What he means is, if I washed my bloody hands in all the water, in all the seas, in all the world, it wouldn't make my hands clean, but make the sea red. That's how guilty I am. He recognises that he better get used to his guilt because it's going to stay with him forever. His wife, Lady Macbeth, is in denial. She just says, "A little water clears us of this deed," meaning we can wash our hands and forget about this. She's the one later, however, who ends up walking and talking in her sleep, staring at her hands, muttering, "Ouch, damned spot," at the blood that she sees, and which ends up leading her to her suicide. This is the kind of guilt and trauma that Armitage is alluding to, and a brief little Macbeth reference in your essay could maybe get you some marks for placing the poem into a literary context. The blood is such a central image in this poem. If you're linking it with war photographer, of course, you could mention the red light in the photographer's darkroom, which is mentioned in the first stanza. On a literal level, it's red because that's the colour of the dim light that's needed when you're developing photos in the traditional way. In the dark room of his mind, though, the red clearly symbolises the guilt he feels at taking photos of the victims of war rather than stopping to help. He's haunted by the dilemma he constantly faces on a professional level, whether to take the photo or stop and save a life. In Remains, the other obvious mention of blood is the blood shadow which stays on the street as a constant reminder to him week after week. I love this word. To me, there's something blunt and gruesome and vivid about the image. It's a compound noun, a noun formed by joining two other nouns together. As such, there's something very Germanic and Anglo-Saxon about it. It's like the kind of Anglo-Saxon or Old English vocabulary used in the oldest of English poems, Beowulf. Beowulf, you might have seen the film, is an Old English epic poem written about 1,000 years ago about kings and dragons and valour and honour. It uses lots of these compound nouns or figures of speech, sometimes called kennings. So for instance, at the beginning, I love the word it uses for the sea. It calls it the whale road. What a brilliant image. Or later, in a battle, it refers to Beowulf losing his battle sweat, another word or image for his blood. Can you see what I mean? There's something graphic and amazingly evocative about these images, and it's just like what Armitage is doing here when he talks about the blood shadow. He may be a 20th century soldier fighting in a very modern war, but the reality is the same. The haunting image of human blood stained into the ground and seared into his memory.